3 weeks before my wedding, I learned sign language for the most innocent of reasons. I simply wanted my future mother-in-law to feel less alone in my home. I never suspected either of them. I wasn't searching for a lie. But one evening, while wedding invoices covered the kitchen island, he signed something to her about my accounts, the house, and how everything would become so much easier once I was legally tied to him. Then she answered with a smile that did not belong to a mother. I understood every word. My blood ran cold, and before either of them noticed me standing there in the hallway, I realized something terrifying. The wedding wasn't their celebration. It was their deadline. At first, Martha's presence in my home had felt like a test of my generosity, not my judgment. David, my fiancé, had introduced her as his mother. A woman, he explained, who had lost both her hearing and speech after a childhood illness. Martha was in her late 50s, elegant in a restrained way, with silver-threaded hair, careful posture, and this peculiar habit of smiling before anyone finished speaking. She moved into my house just 3 weeks before the wedding because David said living alone had become too difficult for her. I agreed before he even finished asking. The guest suite was spacious, and I truly wanted David to see that marriage would never force him to choose between us. I also genuinely wanted Martha to feel welcome. I installed a visual doorbell near her room, carefully labeled several cabinets in the kitchen, and left handwritten notes beside the coffee machine so she wouldn't need David for every small question. For the first few days, he translated everything. Martha would sign, David would answer aloud, and then I would respond. Our meals felt awkward, yes, but sincere. I convinced myself that the silence between us was only unfamiliarity, a new dynamic we would all learn to navigate. Then, the translations began shrinking. A minute of rapid, intricate signing from Martha would become a clipped, "She likes the flowers." A tense exchange over breakfast, punctuated by urgent hand movements, would be reduced to, "She didn't sleep well." Once, Martha pointed toward a stack of wedding papers on the kitchen island and signed for nearly 30 seconds straight. David glanced at me, his expression unreadable, and said, "She thinks the invitations are beautiful." The explanation did not match his eyes. It didn't match the intensity of Martha's earlier signing at all. Still, I refused to turn discomfort into suspicion. I had spent too much of my life measuring people's motives, always looking for the catch, the hidden agenda. I didn't want that kind of caution to poison the first family I was choosing for myself, the family I was building. That was why I started learning sign language out of pure, unadulterated curiosity. I told myself it was also kindness. I wanted to surprise Martha at the rehearsal dinner with a few simple sentences she could understand directly, without David standing between us, always interpreting. I enrolled in evening lessons with Chloe Vance, a retired interpreter who taught from a small, cozy studio across town. I told David the appointments were wedding consultations, last-minute vendor checks, things like that. He believed me. He always had, because I'd always handled the details, the logistics, the behind-the-scenes arrangements alone. At home, I practiced only after they went to bed or behind the closed door of my office. The secrecy felt harmless then, almost playful, like planning a delightful surprise. Meanwhile, David and Martha grew less careful. Their hands moved across the dinner table while I reviewed bills. They signed in the living room while I answered work messages. Sometimes they stopped when I entered a room. More often, they simply continued, convinced that I couldn't possibly understand. The house was still quiet, yes, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. I felt like an intruder in my own home, a silent witness to conversations I wasn't meant to hear. By the second week of lessons, I could follow simple conversations. By the third, I could recognize tone. And that, Chloe had taught me, mattered more than vocabulary. Sign language lived in the face as much as the hands. A tightened mouth could turn patience into contempt. A raised eyebrow could make a question sound like a warning. Once I understood that, David's translations began to feel less incomplete and more deliberately false. A gnawing unease started to settle deep in my gut. Still, I said nothing. I kept my poker face, kept my questions light, kept the wedding plans moving forward. I needed more. I needed proof. That evening, I came home earlier than expected. Wedding contracts and unpaid bills were spread across the kitchen island, waiting for me to review them. David and Martha were in the living room, seated close enough that their knees nearly touched. Neither of them noticed me in the hallway, standing silent, holding my breath. Martha signed first. Her hands moved quickly, impatiently. How much longer? David glanced toward the kitchen, then back at her, his expression a tight, dismissive line. Asterisk until the wedding. After that, she'll stop asking why things need to be separate. Asterisk. My hand tightened around the folder I was carrying, the edges digging into my palm. Separate? What exactly did he mean by separate? My mind raced, trying to piece together fragments, but I couldn't. Not yet. Martha then asked whether he had convinced me to add him to the household account. Not yet, he signed, a faint smile playing on his lips. Asterisk, but she already agreed I can handle recurring payments after we marry. Once the monthly bills move through the shared account, small transfers won't look unusual. Asterisk small transfers. My blood ran cold for the second time that night. He wasn't talking about taking everything at once, like a grand theft. He was describing something slower, quieter, far more believable. Rounded amounts disguised as household expenses. Payments shifted into accounts he controlled. Renovation costs approved for work that would never happen. Enough movement each month to drain hundreds of thousands over time without triggering immediate panic. It was insidious. It was brilliant. It was horrifying. Martha's expression hardened. And the house, David's smile widened, a chilling, predatory grin. Asterisk, she believes the ownership paperwork is only for estate planning. After the wedding, I'll push her to add me if she hesitates. You'll have another health crisis. She won't want to look cruel. Asterisk, the room seemed to tilt around me. Martha wasn't simply pretending to be dependent. Her role was pressure. She gave David a moral excuse to ask for money, for space, for access. Any refusal from me could be reframed as heartlessness toward a disabled, aging mother. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Then she signed again. Her hands were precise, cutting through the air. And after we leave, David replied, his voice a low, casual rumble as if he were simply discussing the weather, we don't leave until the accounts are clean. I froze. My pulse hammered so violently I could feel it behind my eyes, a frantic thrumming, but the rest of me went absolutely still. The folder edge pressed painfully into my palm. The refrigerator hummed behind me in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, and the ordinary sound felt impossibly far away, like it belonged to a different world. Martha leaned closer to David, her gaze intense. You promised this would be easier than Denver? David's face changed. Not surprised, no. Annoyance. Pure, unfiltered annoyance. It will be if you stop calling me your son when we're alone. The meaning hit harder than the money, harder than the house, harder than any betrayal I had imagined. They were not mother and son. Martha was his partner in the scheme. The disability, the lost hearing and speech, the years of sacrifice, all of it was part of the performance. They had used the role before, in another city, against someone else. A cold, dreadful certainty settled over me. David looked up. His eyes, searching, landed on the hallway. For one terrifying second, his gaze met mine. My breath caught in my throat. I lowered my gaze to the folder in my hands and forced my expression into one of mild distraction, as if I hadn't seen a thing. Have either of you seen the florist's invoice? I asked, my voice miraculously steady, a little too bright. David answered aloud, perfectly calm, his voice betraying nothing. On the counter, Martha gave me her familiar, fragile smile, the one that used to make me feel so warm and generous. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the invoice, and left without rushing, without a single backward glance. Only after I had locked my bedroom door did I let myself breathe. The man I was supposed to marry had not chosen me. He had selected me. I wasn't his love, I was his mark. I did not confront David that night. For several minutes, I sat on the edge of my bed with both hands pressed flat against the blanket, trying desperately to separate fear from fact. The temptation to walk back downstairs, to throw open the living room door and demand an explanation, to watch their faces crumble, was almost physical. I imagined his shock, Martha's exposed expression, the satisfaction of letting them know their performance had failed. Then I imagined what would happen next. They were living in my house. David knew my routines, my schedule, and which wedding arrangements were already in motion, irreversible. Martha had spent weeks studying how I responded to guilt, to emotional manipulation. If they discovered that I understood sign language, they would stop talking openly, destroy whatever evidence existed, and invent a cleaner story before I could prove anything. Worse, they might simply pack up and leave before I understood the full extent of their plan, vanishing with their secrets. No, confrontation was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not yet. So, I decided to let them believe I was still blind. The next morning, I followed my usual routine. I drank coffee at the kitchen island, reviewed wedding payments, and even asked David whether he preferred the chicken or salmon option for the reception. When Martha signed something about me, her hands darting, I kept my eyes on the guest list, pretending to be engrossed. David translated. "She says you look tired." What Martha had actually signed was, "Is she acting different?" I smiled and blamed a late work call. That moment confirmed two things. They were watching me, searching for any change in my demeanor, any flicker of suspicion. And they were not yet certain. I used their uncertainty carefully, because all three of us still lived under the same roof. I needed believable reasons to move without drawing attention. My job already required private calls, so I began spending longer periods behind my office door, the phone pressed to my ear, a blank document on my screen. I scheduled errands during times David usually took Martha to appointments, giving myself a window of freedom. I kept wedding consultations on the calendar, giving myself ordinary, unquestionable reasons to meet people outside the house. At home, I remained meticulously predictable. I left harmless paperwork where David expected to see it. I discussed flowers, seating charts, and bills aloud. I even asked his opinion on small purchases so he would continue believing I was preparing to share responsibility with him, to hand over control, piece by piece. Privately, behind closed doors, I wrote down every single detail I remembered: the shared account, the fake renovation expenses, the plan involving the house, and that chilling reference to Denver. I did not rely on memory alone. I dated each note and stored copies outside the house with someone I trusted, just in case. I also stopped signing anything without review. That was the first safeguard. The second was time. I quietly delayed the account changes David expected, telling him the bank required additional review, new paperwork. I postponed the ownership documents by blaming a scheduling issue with the lawyers. Nothing was canceled. Nothing looked like resistance. Freezing had felt like helplessness in the living room. Now, I understood it differently. By not reacting, by allowing them to continue their performance, I had preserved the one thing they could not plan around, the fact that I knew exactly who they were. While they still believed they knew exactly who I was. Once I knew the shape of the plan, I stopped thinking like a betrayed fiancé and started thinking like someone responsible for her own survival. My first call was to an attorney I had worked with before, someone discreet and meticulously thorough. I didn't tell her the full, terrifying story over the phone. I only said I needed an urgent, confidential review of anything connected to the wedding, the house, and any shared financial authority. We met in person the very next afternoon. While David believed I was out finalizing reception details, I was sitting across from a legal expert, detailing the chilling implications of every document he'd pushed my way. The attorney confirmed what I feared, what I had refused to fully acknowledge until that moment. Marriage alone wouldn't give David automatic control of everything I owned, but the specific documents he had been subtly encouraging me to sign, the ones I'd almost signed without a second thought, could create exactly the kind of unfettered access he wanted. A shared household account would make transfers easier to disguise, just as he'd planned. A broad financial authorization could allow him to manage payments in my name, effectively emptying my accounts on his terms. And adding him to the house? That would give him leverage, a legal claim, even if the marriage ended quickly. My stomach tightened, a cold knot of dread. This wasn't just about money, it was about losing everything: my home, my independence, my very future. The safeguards became agonizingly specific, each one a direct counter to a step in their scheme. First, I canceled the pending household account request entirely and told the bank, in writing, that no new signer could be added without my physical presence and independent, verbal confirmation. Then, I revoked every single temporary permission David had received for wedding bills, vendor deposits, and recurring household payments. Anything legitimate could still be paid, of course, but only after direct approval from me. This meant every single outgoing payment would need my explicit, documented consent. No more quiet transfers. Third, and perhaps most crucially, I placed the house into a protected arrangement that could not be changed casually after the wedding. David would not become an owner simply because of a signature slipped between ceremony paperwork. My home was safe. Fourth, I asked for a quiet review of any unusual payments from the previous 2 months. That search, that careful, forensic examination of my own financial records, uncovered exactly what I expected. Several small charges David had described as deposits, renovation estimates, consultation fees, and services that had never been scheduled, never performed. None was large enough alone to alarm me, none would have triggered a red flag on its own. But together, they showed a pattern. They showed rehearsal. They showed practice runs for the larger theft he planned. The reference to Denver, the one that had twisted my gut in the living room, mattered too. Through my attorney, I hired a private investigator, licensed to conduct lawful background checks. Within days, the results began to trickle in, each one a brutal confirmation. We confirmed that David and Martha had used different last names in another state. They were not related. They had lived together for years, not just recently, and had previously been questioned after another engagement ended abruptly over unexplained financial transfers. This wasn't a one-time desperate act. This was a practiced, cold-blooded scheme. This gave me proof, undeniable, tangible proof, not merely suspicion. I shared all the information with local authorities, following their instructions to the letter. I did not search David's belongings, I did not access his private accounts, I did not provoke a confession. I provided only what I had lawfully observed, my own financial records, and the documentation uncovered through proper, legal channels. Living with them while all of this happened was, without a doubt, the hardest part. Every single day was a performance. I kept my office door closed during calls, my voice low and hushed, pretending to be on work business. I scheduled meetings during Martha's appointments, when David was out of the house, allowing me to move freely. I stored important papers outside the house, stashing them with my trusted friend, Eleanor, so they wouldn't be found during a casual search. At dinner, I let David talk about our future, our plans, our shared life, while Martha signed impatient questions about money, her eyes on me, searching for any sign of resistance. They believed I was simply delaying paperwork because I was busy, overwhelmed by wedding plans. In reality, every single path into my life, every avenue for their theft, was slowly but surely closing. By the time David finally noticed that nothing was actually moving forward, that the bank access was gone, the house was protected, the suspicious payments were meticulously documented, and their false identities had been irrefutably confirmed. I hadn't trapped them. I had simply made sure their plan could no longer reach me, could no longer touch a single thing I owned. The final wedding meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. David believed we were going to approve the remaining payments and sign the last, crucial documents. Martha dressed carefully that morning, wearing the same soft gray cardigan she always used whenever she wanted to appear fragile, dependent. At breakfast, she signed that everything would finally be settled. David answered aloud, a smug confidence in his voice, by tonight. I understood exactly what he meant. They thought their payday was hours away. I left the house as usual, carrying a folder of wedding papers, a convincing prop. But instead of going to the venue, I drove to a private office in the city, where my attorney and the investigator were already waiting. A detective joined us shortly afterward. The suspicious payments alone weren't enough to prove the entire scheme, not yet, but the false identities, the earlier complaint in Denver, and David's repeated, documented attempts to gain financial authority, to control my life, created a pattern the authorities could and would act on. Then they told me something that turned my blood cold. Do not return home alone. That was the moment the danger became terrifyingly real. Until then, I had treated everything like a complex problem to solve, a puzzle to meticulously piece together. Sitting in that quiet office, surrounded by professionals, I finally allowed myself to understand the full, visceral impact of what had been happening. 2 people, strangers, had been living inside my house, sharing my meals, studying my habits, observing my weaknesses, and waiting for the law to bind me to them, to make me legally vulnerable. My hands began to shake, not from uncertainty, not from doubt, but from a delayed, overwhelming fear that had finally caught up. The officers arrived at the house before I did. David opened the door expecting me, perhaps a little irritated by my tardiness, but instead, he found 2 detectives and my attorney standing calmly on my doorstep. Martha stopped pretending almost immediately. When an officer addressed her, asking for identification, she answered aloud. Her voice was low, clear, and completely natural, utterly devoid of the soft, hesitant quality I had grown accustomed to. David turned toward her with a look of pure, unadulterated rage, not because she had lied to me, not because she had betrayed me, but because she had broken character. Their performance, their carefully constructed illusion, was shattering right before his eyes. By the time I entered with my attorney, their belongings were already being gathered, placed into small duffel bags. Because the house belonged solely to me, they had no ownership rights, no claim to anything within its walls. My attorney formally revoked David's permission to remain there and provided written notice that Martha's temporary stay had ended. The officers remained present, a silent, imposing barrier to prevent threats, destruction, or any attempt to pressure me further. David demanded to speak with me privately, his voice tight with desperation. I refused, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. He stared at me, then at my attorney, then back at me, his eyes searching, desperate for an explanation. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for, the one I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times. How long have you known? I looked at Martha, whose face was now a mask of cold fury, her disability completely gone. Then I looked back at David, meeting his gaze directly. Long enough, I said, my voice quiet but firm, to hear what you said before my wedding. His face emptied. All the fight, all the cunning, drained from him in an instant. Martha understood first. Her eyes moved slowly to my hands, then back to my face, as if she could suddenly see every sign language lesson I had taken, every conversation I had understood, every single mistake they had made, oblivious, right in front of me. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, but this time, it was a silence I owned. They left under supervision, taking only their personal belongings. Everything else was documented and secured. Everything else was documented and secured. The front door clicked shut behind them, and then, a profound quiet descended upon my house. Not the suffocating, watchful silence that had been my constant companion for weeks, but a new kind of quiet. A vast, echoing emptiness that, paradoxically, felt like relief. I stood there, in the living room, exactly where I had once frozen, listening to them plot my financial ruin, watching them perform their cruel charade. Now, the silence belonged to me again. It was no longer their weapon. It was simply stillness. My attorney stayed with me for a while, just to make sure I was okay, to talk through the next steps. But even after she left, the feeling of being truly alone in my home was overwhelming. It wasn't the lonely quiet I'd known before David, the kind that made you wish for company. This was the quiet aftermath of a storm, a ringing in my ears after an explosion, a sense of space opening up where a suffocating presence had been. Every room felt enormous, suddenly filled with the absence of their calculating eyes, their whispering hands. The authorities, true to their word, continued their investigation. The false payments, the documented attempts to gain control of my assets, the fabricated identities, all of it began to weave a tighter net around them. The previous complaint in Denver wasn't just a ghost story, it was a precedent, a chilling echo of their past crimes. Knowing that justice was slowly, meticulously working its way toward them brought a strange, cold comfort. It wasn't about revenge, not truly. It was about affirmation. About knowing that the reality I had uncovered, the truth that had almost shattered my life, was indeed real, and that others saw it too. But before any of that, there was the wedding. The wedding that would never happen. My attorney handled the cancellations. I couldn't bring myself to make those calls, to explain, to revisit the details of a day that was supposed to be the beginning of a joyous future, but had been nothing more than a carefully chosen deadline. She contacted the vendors, informing them that due to unforeseen circumstances, the event was off. She made sure David couldn't use my name, couldn't access any of the deposits, couldn't cause any further damage. Each cancellation was a small, sharp pain. A tearing away of a future I had built in my mind, a future with a man who had never existed. It wasn't just a party I was canceling, it was a dream. A family. A life. All of it dissolved into a series of formal emails and phone calls. I walked through the house in the days that followed, seeing it with new eyes. The guest suite, once prepared with such care for Martha, now felt tainted. The visual doorbell, the labeled cabinets, the handwritten notes, every gesture of kindness I had extended, every effort to make her feel welcome, now mocked me with their innocence. They had not been received as kindness, they had been catalogued as vulnerabilities. My generosity had been a data point in their scheme. The kitchen island, once covered with wedding invoices and future plans, now seemed like a silent witness to their deceit. I remembered David's dismissive translations, Martha's tight-lipped smiles. I remembered the night I overheard them, the words that turned my world upside down. That space, that ordinary island, had become the epicenter of my betrayal. It took time, but gradually I started to reclaim it. To fill it with my own things, to make new memories, to banish the ghosts of their conspiracy. My story didn't end with a wedding. It ended with something far more valuable than a ceremony or a ring: certainty. I learned that betrayal isn't always loud, isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it arrives dressed as devotion, whispers sweet nothings in your ear, sits comfortably inside your home, and depends entirely on your kindness, your trust, your desire for connection, to remain invisible. David and Martha, they counted on me feeling too guilty to question, too embarrassed to admit doubt, too emotionally invested to slow down the momentum of the wedding. They believed my independence was loneliness, that my desire for a family meant I would tolerate anything that threatened to take that dream away. They mistook my compassion for weakness, my willingness to trust for gullibility. What they failed to understand, what they fundamentally miscalculated, was that compassion and intelligence can absolutely exist in the same person. I didn't protect myself by becoming cruel or cynical. I protected myself by becoming precise. I verified everything I heard. I closed every single access point to my money, my assets, my home. I brought in professionals, an attorney, an investigator, the authorities, instead of taking reckless, emotional risks. Most importantly, I refused to let the immediate, burning need for emotional satisfaction, for a confrontation, place me in greater danger. My restraint wasn't passivity, it was strategy. It was the only way to truly survive. There's a deeper lesson in the way David chose me. He saw my strength, my self-sufficiency, my carefully built life, and he saw it not as something to admire, but as something to exploit. He assumed that because I wanted love, I would surrender my judgment. But wanting love doesn't mean surrendering your intuition. And walking away from a false future, from a life built on lies, isn't a failure. Sometimes, it's the clearest, most courageous form of self-respect. It's choosing yourself, even when it means tearing down everything you thought you were building. The silence in my house now is a different kind of silence. It's a space where I can hear my own thoughts, unburdened by hidden meanings, free from the constant, gnawing question of what they were really saying. It's the sound of a future being rebuilt, brick by careful brick, on a foundation of truth. That future, built on truth, began to solidify the moment the police cruisers pulled into my driveway. I was still minutes away, meeting with my attorney and the detective, but I imagined it all with a chilling clarity. David, opening the door, expecting me, his fiancé, ready to finalize our future. Instead, he found uniformed officers, my attorney, and the cold, unyielding face of the law. When I arrived, the scene was already in motion. Martha, her carefully constructed fragility dissolving like sugar in water, had dropped the act entirely. An officer addressed her, and she responded, her voice low, clear, and utterly natural. No sign language. No feigned disability. Just the raw, unadulterated sound of a woman who had simply stopped bothering to pretend. David spun on her, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. It wasn't anger that she'd lied to me, it was fury that she had broken character, jeopardizing their entire performance. Their belongings were already being gathered, efficient and impersonal. My attorney, calm and resolute, formally revoked David's permission to remain on my property. Martha's temporary stay, she stated, was officially over. The officers stood nearby, their presence a silent, unwavering barrier against any threats, any destruction, any final attempts at manipulation. I watched them move, these two people who had so intimately invaded my life, now reduced to figures under a spotlight, their charade exposed. David demanded to speak with me. Privately. His eyes, once so full of practiced affection, now burned with something desperate and dangerous. I simply shook my head. No. There was nothing left to say, nothing to explain in private that hadn't already been revealed in public. He pressed, a final, desperate attempt to regain some control. And then he asked the question I had been waiting for, the one that would finally acknowledge the truth of what had happened. How long have you known? I looked at Martha first. Her gaze was fixed, unblinking. Then, slowly, I turned back to David, meeting his eyes head-on. My voice was steady, calm, devoid of the emotion that had been churning inside me for weeks. Long enough, I told him, to hear everything you said before my wedding. His face emptied. The color drained from it, leaving behind a stark, hollow shock. But it was Martha who truly understood. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, flickered from my face to my hands, as if she could suddenly see every sign language lesson I had taken, every conversation I had understood, every mistake they had so carelessly made right in front of me. The mask was gone. The cunning, the calculation, the pure, cold betrayal was laid bare. It was over. They left under supervision, taking only their personal belongings. Everything else, every piece of paper, every item they'd brought into my home, was documented and secured as evidence. The authorities confirmed their false identities, the pattern of their crimes. The initial complaint in Denver, the earlier engagement that had ended in financial ruin for someone else, it all coalesced into a damning case. That evening, the wedding was officially canceled. My attorney handled all the vendors, making sure David couldn't use my name, my reputation, my carefully planned future for any further schemes. When the front door finally closed, when the last echo of their presence faded from the hallway, the house felt enormous. I stood in the living room, the very spot where I had first frozen, listening to the quiet that had once been their weapon. Now it belonged to me again. It was the sound of my own breath, my own heartbeat, clear and strong. My story didn't end with a wedding. It ended with something far more profound, far more valuable than a ceremony or a ring. It ended with certainty. I learned that betrayal isn't always loud, isn't always dramatic, isn't always a sudden explosion. Sometimes, it arrives dressed as devotion, sits comfortably inside your home, whispers sweet nothings, and depends entirely on your kindness, your trust, your desire for connection, to remain invisible. David and Martha, they mistook my independence for loneliness. They assumed that because I wanted love, I would surrender my judgment. But wanting love doesn't mean giving up your intuition. And walking away from a false future, from a life built on lies, isn't a failure. It's the clearest, most courageous form of self-respect. It's choosing yourself, even when it means tearing down everything you thought you were building. The silence in my house now is a different kind of silence. It's a space where I can hear my own thoughts, unburdened by hidden meanings, free from the constant, gnawing question of what they were really saying. It's the sound of a future being rebuilt, brick by careful brick, on a foundation of truth. A future where genuine connection, authentic love, and unwavering trust are not just hopes, but non-negotiable pillars. So, I have to ask you, thinking about my story, if you discovered that someone you loved had been quietly building a plan around your trust, meticulously charting out your vulnerabilities, would you confront them immediately, fueled by anger and the need for an explanation? Or would you, like me, first make sure they could no longer harm you, systematically closing off every avenue of attack before they even knew you were aware? And where should the line be drawn between giving someone the benefit of the doubt, holding on to hope for the best, and listening to that gut feeling, that instinct trying to tell you something is terribly wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If Eleanor's story reminded you that boundaries can be both compassionate and incredibly firm, subscribe for more stories about betrayal, resilience, and the quiet decisions that change everything.